Ladies and gentlemen, we're here this morning to listen to the presentation regarding unit number 4. It's my understanding that this is Reno High School. Is that correct?
Yes.
Good, we're in the right place. My name is Elliot Sattler. I'm the presiding judge in Department 10 of the 2nd Judicial District Court here in Reno. And I'd like to have the distinguished people to my right introduce themselves, beginning with Mr. Flair.
Good morning, I'm Frank Flaherty. I'm the past president of the State Bar of Nevada.
Good morning, I'm Christine Hull, and I'm the curriculum specialist for the state of Nevada for social studies.
And if you could introduce yourselves, beginning with Ms. Stimac. Is it Stimac?
Steinmack.
Steinmack. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. I'm Emily Steinmack.
Good morning, my name is Henry Dean.
My name is Brenna Adams.
Good morning, Clark Noble.
My name is Brooke O'Neill, and our coach and teacher is Mr. Clark. Thank you.
Good morning. And as I've previously stated, this is Unit 4, and so let's get right into it. How and why did the founders create America's system of federalism? How does federalism limit the powers of both the national government and the states? And how does federalism extend opportunities for citizen participation? Please begin.
James Madison in Federalist 51 said that, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. By founding a new government, the framers wanted to create a symbiotic relationship between the federal branches and the states as the basis of the American system.
Merging the unitary British government along with the inadequacies of the Articles of Confederation, a well-rounded government was formed. Checks and balances satisfied most political factions by distributing authority to individuals. In a compound republic of America, the power surrounded by the people was first divided between the state and federal government.
Originally, American federalism was a layered cake model because of the defined limits and powers of the state and federal governments. Before the Civil War, the state and federal governments coexisted with one another and formed the concept of dual federalism. During the Civil War, the federal government intruded on the state governments to deinstitutionalize slavery, and the states used the nullification theory to invalidate the laws of the federal government.
In the case of Abelman v. Booth of 1859, the Supreme Court overturned the ruling by the Wisconsin Supreme Court and ruled that the state courts did not have the power to overturn federal court decisions. This ruling upheld the Supremacy Clause, which makes federal policies the supreme law of the land and supersedes state laws. Federalism limits the state governments because they are subjected to obey the laws passed by the federal government, and all state laws will be overridden by the federal policy.
Congress used the Commerce Clause in Article 1, Section 8 to regulate marijuana use within states. In the Gonzales v. Raich case of 2005, the United States Supreme Court ruled that under the Commerce Clause, Congress may criminalize the production of homegrown cannabis despite state laws. However, Colorado and Washington test the bounds of congressional authority because these states have issued referendums legalizing the use for marijuana for recreational and medicinal purposes against federal policies.
President Barack Obama implemented a reform to the Affordable Care Act, allowing states and citizens a continuation of their current insurance policies that might have been otherwise affected by the Affordable Care Act. President Obama tossed this issue back to the states to let them untangle the rules and decide for themselves.
Kirby Hickenlooper, a case working in the federal courts, questioned whether the referendum policy in Colorado is a violation of the Republican form of government, granted in Article 4, Section 4. If the courts rule against the referendum, then the federal government will need to step in the state of Colorado and rewrite the state constitution to ensure that the state can provide a Republican form of government.
Theodore Roosevelt commented that the first requisite of a good citizen in this republic of ours is that he shall be able and willing to pull his own weight. Federalism provides more levels of government and more opportunities for citizens to participate in state and national issues. Governor Sandoval is an example of civic participation through his public service. He started as a state assemblyman, became an attorney general, then a federal judge, and is now Nevada's 29th governor.
Student protesters during the Vietnam War actively voiced their opinions against the actions taken by the executive branch and rallied for the end of the war. Public demonstrations can influence political figures, as for Republican Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey, who stopped fighting against the homosexual law within the state despite his party's views.
As President John F. Kennedy said in his 1961 inaugural address, My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Through the concept of enlightened self-interest, the Founding Fathers knew that citizen participation was a necessary requirement of a functioning of a republic. Citizens have the tools to enact change to a swath of avenues through their local assemblies, state legislatures, or the federal government. The public must know the reasons for governmental decisions if it is to retain confidence in the equity of those decisions. An active and well-informed public must be present to increase the transparency of the government. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Flaherty, would you like to start with a follow-up question?
Yes, thank you. So we were talking about the supremacy clause. So my question for you is if we have a situation where the state government refuses to follow a legitimate national law, what remedies does the federal government have under the supremacy clause to force the state government to comply?
An example of the states going against the federal government or the supremacy clause is Colorado or Washington with cannabis. They legalized it. And another example of the federal government stepping in or using the supremacy clause is the DEA can still prosecute people that are smoking cannabis or using cannabis because it goes against a federal law or the supremacy clause, but is legal in their states.
Congress tried to enact the Defense of Marriage Act, or otherwise known as DOMA, but in the case of Windsor v. U.S., the states deemed DOMA unconstitutional, and therefore the federal government had to toss the issue back to the states. And if we look at states such as Hawaii, New Jersey, or California, they do recognize gay marriage, whereas otherwise states such as Texas have written in their state constitution that they will not provide for gay marriage.
I actually have an uncle whose significant other was a veteran who was deployed in Afghanistan. And while he was in Afghanistan, he actually met a couple of other people in this situation, and they lived in the state of Texas. So in the state of Texas right now, homosexual veterans are actually denied benefits by the state. But in the national government, they are allowed to gain these benefits. But the state government in itself says that these homosexual veterans are not getting these benefits. So an example where you can see the federal government intrude on state Texas constitution would be if they sent in troops or mandated that the state of Texas provide these benefits for these homosexual veterans.
All right. Many critics have said that the national government has abused its constitutional authority over the last 50 to 60 years. Do you agree? And if so, please provide some specific examples and constitutional references.
If you look at the court case U.S. v. Lopez, it is the first court case since the New Deal that set limits on Congress's Commerce Clause. The first one since the New Deal, which said that Congress tried, a kid brought in a gun to give to another kid at a school, and he was charged with a federal crime. And Congress tried to use the Commerce Clause to regulate that, but the government said that gun policies do not fall under the Commerce Clause.
I don't think Congress is abusing their power much. In the case of Rice v. Cayetano case of 2000, Hawaii had a state law saying that you were unable to vote within their state elections unless you could prove that you had a native lineage of Hawaiian. And in that case, the judicial branch ruled against the state of Hawaii, and the federal government was able to intrude in the state of Hawaii under the 15th Amendment, saying that no one should be denied the right to vote because of race, family lineage, etc. So I don't think they're abusing that power at all.
I do believe the executive branch, if we're to look at the federal government, has radically expanded its power. For example, President Bill Clinton vetoed the federal budget 82 times. So the sole power of the veto has radically expanded presidential power in a way that has impacted the government in large effects.
Another example of the president expanding his power is President George W. Bush, who's signing statements 1,200 times. That is basically saying you sign in the bill, but you attach a letter to the front of the bill saying, I accept this policy, this policy, but don't accept certain policies. This can basically completely alter the law.
Was the establishment of America's federal system a well-thought-out plan of government or a byproduct of whimsy and happen chance?
The federal government was thought out perfectly because of laboratories of democracy, where states get their own chance to implement their own rules. which is seen with the Affordable Care Act when it started in Massachusetts, and also with cannabis such as Colorado or Washington.
Going off of what Clark said, the system of federalism in America was pretty well thought out, but it has evolved over time because of natural changes that have occurred, such as during the Civil War, and then again FDR, who used a lot of federal policies over the state governments.
James Madison in Federalist Paper 45 said that the federal government would be most extensive in times of war and danger, and those of state governments in times of peace and security. So I do believe both the federal government and the state governments have created a equilibrium between the two to balance powers and authorities in different times and political crises.
I would say that federalism is a pretty thought-out system. In some cases that these states can act as laboratories of democracy, which essentially they can experiment with any types of laws that they deem fit, and if it does work out in that state, then it can be applied to the national standard. So an example with this would be in the state of Nevada. We have legalized prostitution in certain counties in our state, and if this does work and we do create efficient laws and regulations, then we can expand these laws onto the federal government and even the national government.
Has that happened? I'm just curious, Mr. Ring, about the application of prostitution in the state of Nevada. I don't think any other state's lining up for a federal system of prostitution.
I mean, if you want another example, no, that has never happened, but if you want another example, Michigan right now is considering whether or not they should implement an abortion policy. So instead of you just going out to abortion, it's being covered under your health care coverage. So if that actually works in the state of Michigan, then you can apply it to everywhere across the globe, or even across the United States.
Good example. Thank you.
Hopefully a better.
So, in terms of the federal system, our federalist setup here, how might that system pose challenges to a citizen's loyalty?
Well, the biggest challenge, one, is the supremacy clause, because there's all these laws that are going on. In the states, there's examples such as Nevada where gambling is legal, but in the federal government it is legal, but in certain states it's not. So there's this question of which law do I follow? Do I follow the federal government or the state's rules? So there's a bunch of confusion with it.
Going off of what Clark said, a citizen's loyalty may be referenced in the case of Oregon v. Mitchell of 1970. Oregon challenged the Voting Rights Act Amendment of 1970, but the federal government upheld that Oregon could not change, the state of Oregon could not change the voter laws, or could not lower the voting age. So there's an unclear boundary between what rights apply to state governments and what rights apply to federal governments.
You can also look at the court case Chisholm v. Georgia, where Chisholm sued the state of Georgia because Georgia owed them money, and he actually won the case, making citizenship participation in the citizen a little bit more powerful than the state during that time, which was revolutionary.
And this is the beauty of the federalism system. You can participate in both the local, state, and even national organizations. So I can go from each state protesting certain things that are bad in that state while still making a national precedence as well. So that's the beauty of federalism.
The issue with loyalty for citizens would be if the state policies went against the federal policies. So an example would be during desegregation. A lot of the southern states didn't follow the federal policies that the government had decided.
So if you had only the amount of time in an elevator with someone who was not American, and you had to explain what federalism was, it's called an elevator speech, so you usually have 3 seconds, right? What is federalism? How would you explain it?
If the person in the elevator had seen the movie Hunger Games, I would describe it with that literary device saying that the 13 districts, or 12 or 13 districts of the Hunger Games book, and the capital would act as the federal government, and then there'd be the 13 districts that act as the state, and they somewhat coexist together, working in that book.
I describe federalism as kind of a milkshake. There's ice cream, and then there's chocolate sauce in there. And the chocolate sauce is the federal government, and the ice cream is the states. And they're both entangled, and you can't really pick them apart, but they're both there coexisting and working together.
I would describe federalism as a house of cards because you need each card in order to have the federal government stand. So if you pull one state out, then the entire federal government crumbles. So the relationship between the two is so vital that one cannot exist without the other.
maybe you have one time for one more question. Should all licensing, that means teachers' license, driver's licenses, doctors, lawyers, and marriages as well, be under a national jurisdiction, or should each individual state be able to make their own rules for licensing?
I mean, there should be a national standard, but that national standard should be very minimal as to what profession you want to go into. And then once you find a specific spot as to where you can get a job, whether it be the state of Nevada or the state of Florida, then I believe the states themselves should be able to include more standards to actually reflect what they want from their workers. So it varies from state to state, but the national government should just have a minimal standard.
And with that, we'll be finished. Thank you. You with a little bit of feedback about how you did, and I know you also want to take a breath, so I'll be very brief about this. I thought that you did an excellent job splitting up the work and giving answers from each one of you. I thought that one of the strong points really was the fact that you were able to go seamlessly throughout different periods of our country, the New Deal, 1787, the founding of the country, the Civil War, DOMA. You really expanded the question and kind of moved it throughout the history of our country, and I thought that was very impressive. And then finally, before I turn it over to Mr. Flaherty, I thought, Mr. Ng, it's easy to give case citations and the citations to the Federalists. Actually, it's not that easy to do that. But what you did was something that I thought was very nimble, and that is that you used a personal reference in one of your examples. And it's always good if you can relate something that directly impacts you. I think it's more forceful when you're trying to argue your position. So when you brought in the same-sex marriage issue and how it related specifically to someone in your family, I thought that was very impressive. Mr. Blair.
Yeah, and I agree with the judge in terms of, I really appreciated the historical perspective in the responses to the questions. I also liked the fact that you obviously mastered the material, and you mastered it at a higher level than just knowing it, and sort of understanding how they all related together. And I like the fact that you still remain adaptive. In other words, you've obviously been practicing this for quite a while, but as you're sitting here, you're really listening to our questions, and that's important. And I like how you can take cues from us. If you're getting feedback like that answer's not really getting us there, you're nimble enough to kind of change directions and make the point with something else that has a little bit more resonance. So really a very good job. Nicely done.
Very much so. And I think just to add on to that, working in a team of 5 can be very difficult because everyone has their own thoughts and opinions, and you all had very clearly different expertise. Some of you really did a lot of research on medical marijuana and all of that case law, which is great because I think bringing up current events is really important. But then several of you clearly had some history and brought up some previous cases, which was also very important. So I think your team worked really well in that some of you had some little current topics to discuss, and then some of you were able to bring up what happened 20, 30 years ago, which as a history teacher is really important for me personally. And I have to tell you that I was so happy to hear the word layer cake. And the other option is make sure you bring up marble cake. And Mr. Clark will appreciate this because now he's going to have to do this, but I used to make my students marble cake and layer cake.
No, I made them bring it. That's the best part.
Oh, see, I brought my students cake. I was a government teacher. So I really appreciated that you brought up what that meant, because I think for the lay person, it's really important to bring up examples that make sense, like your milkshake example. And the way you guys all answered that question with different examples is great, because federalism is not a topic that most people understand, which is why I asked that question. So I love that you all had a way to answer it in your own unique way, which is fabulous. And bringing in personal examples, I agree. Good job.
Well done.